Good to see everybody today. And as Rishi said, I hope everybody had a wonderful Easter. It's beautiful here in Newnan. A little chilly this morning, but it's great to be with you all. I know many of you on the call today. I've had the pleasure to actually do this presentation. I think this is my third time now. My assistant manager, Haskell Craver, has also done this presentation, but I don't know if I've done the presentation to anyone on the call today, so that's good. From the lessons that we learned, we're trying to share this information as much as we can. While we're recovering and we've been successful, there's obviously some critical takeaways for each of you all. And a lot of these things are basically no cost takeaways and something that you and your community should prepare for. So I'm going to try to share my screen here. I got a little presentation that will help us get through this. All right, can you see that?
It's up.
Thumbs up?
Yep.
All right, so we'll talk a little bit about the events leading up to the storm. Just a second. March 25th, as Rishi said, we just actually, had the 1-year anniversary of the storm. And yeah, it's changed a lot of our outlooks on storm preparation. It's changed our community alert and just our general feels inside your families when there's a weather warning issued, and we are in that weather season. I want to talk a little bit about our preparations up before the storm. As usual, most like you guys, we have an emergency preparedness plan that council has adopted. We go through tabletop exercises. We talk about storms. We've responded to small storms. We've actually been part of, I think, 4 different FEMA declarations here in Newnan and Cleatus County in the past, but they've all been pretty minor. Nothing like this particular storm. The night of the storm, we knew that there was a good chance for severe weather, and just like any good city, we had the chainsaws filled up, the chains were sharp. We actually even go through a process where we'll park equipment throughout the city when there's a high probability for storms. That way we can have a quicker response to different parts of the city, not knowing where that storm damage may occur. We had all of our state of emergency ordinances in the hands of the mayor. So we were prepared, but we had no idea what the magnitude of that storm was going to be. You see on the screen there, it's a screenshot of the actual tornado right before it entered into the city limits down around Newnan High School. And at this point in time, I was at home. I hadn't been to the Emergency Operations Center, which we had previously activated with the chance of weather. I was actually watching Channel 5, and a meteorologist, I think, used something like, "Oh my gosh," or something along those, or is look at the debris field right over Newnan High School. It was at that point in time that I knew that we had probably something that we have never experienced in Newnan before, and soon to find out that was certainly the case. I think you probably have heard a little bit about this. It was an EF4 tornado. We had some peak wind speeds of about 170 miles per hour. And what was incredible was the path length was almost 40 miles, 1,850 yards at its widest. So it was a very, very, very wide tornado. Probably one of the most incredible things out of the tornado, you can see there that we technically only had 1 fatality. And that particular fatality was simply because we couldn't get to the individual that suffered a heart attack, and he was helping his daughter to get out of her house that was damaged during the tornado. We certainly are confident if we could have gotten to him, we could have saved him and not had any fatalities. But what we encountered upon our initial response is the roads were just too blocked to access anything. I'll go into more detail about that initial response in just a second. I think Rishi did mention that it was the largest tornado that the state had experienced in 10 years. There was the large outbreak that, obviously about the Tuscaloosa tornadoes 10 years ago that made its way up through Dalton, Ringgold, in that part of the northwestern part of the state 10 years ago. But you can see that with this illustration, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, there's only been 6 EF4 tornadoes on record in the state of Georgia. So trying to plan for that is very difficult. I have told the groups previously when I've done this presentation that about 3 years ago, we actually did a tabletop exercise with our EMA, public safety, and even our public works officials. And that particular tabletop exercise, the theme of it was an EF5 tornado hits downtown Newnan. Now that it's all over, we look back and joke that we'll never do another exercise like that because we only missed it by 1 EF1. We was an EF4 instead of what we modeled as an EF5. But even though we went through all of that emergency preparation and we thought we were prepared, until you get into the heat of the response, I'll be honest with you, a lot of decisions, had to be made on the fly because there's just certain things you cannot predict in a tabletop exercise. That being said, the exercise was certainly beneficial. Talk a little bit. There's a couple of the images you may have seen if you followed it. The yellow Camaro there, what some people refer to as the Bumblebee Camaro. It became kind of famous. That house, which was a basement house, was completely destroyed. That neighborhood was destroyed. Nothing surrounding that Camaro other than it was sitting in the garage where it used to call its home. You can see the remnants of the home and several other homes down in the little stream valley behind the home. Just a couple of more examples of the pictures of the devastation, and I'll get into some of those details more in a minute. Just wanted to give you a couple of examples. I think many of you have seen similar photos from this storm or other similar storms. Obviously, one of the picture on the left there, most everyone knows the substantial damage occurred at Newnan High School. To the point that the majority of the high school campus is being demolished and the high school campus is being rebuilt. I think the right shows you a lot of our utility damage, and I've got, again, more data to show you about our response for our utility repairs. It's pretty staggering. But I do want to talk a little bit about the initial response the night of the tornado. Of course, the tornado struck us right at midnight on the 25th. And I give a lot of credit to our alert systems. I think the alert systems and the early warnings are certainly what caused the amount of casualties of the one and the serious injuries to be relatively low considering the size of the tornado. But the search and recovery. I mean, obviously the number one issue was search for life and property. We did have a system in play to where every time an official group, whether it would be a police officer or whether it was going to be a fireman or EMA official, anytime we would search a property, we had codes that we would actually paint on the properties to indicate we had been there and actually what our findings were. But unfortunately, in some of the buildings, there was no building to actually paint the codes on. So we had to get creative in a lot of instances and paint on trees, paint on stop signs if they were there, paint on curbs, anywhere that we could find to paint, because a lot of like I said, the buildings were gone. The search and recovery was difficult because the majority of the roads were completely impassable. The roads had a large number of trees, utility lines, house debris, cars upside down. It was impossible to get down the majority of the roadways. And what we had to do, we had to use our heavy equipment. We're fortunate we got a pretty good fleet of heavy equipment. We had to use steel track loaders, track hose, and simply at that point in time made it a choice to just drive that equipment down the middle of the road to try to clear the roadway. That was the only way that we could get to and help our public, is to clear the roadway and worry about the damage that we were creating to the roadway later. I mentioned earlier the state of emergency. I'd already prepared Mayor Brady with a copy of that, and shortly after midnight, he had already had signed the state of emergency, which put into play a lot of our emergency powers, and I can get into more details of that in a minute. I've already mentioned opening of the main road networks. Even though there wasn't a lot of phone coverage, a lot of cell coverage was dead, you were still starting to hear from neighbors, and obviously you're going to get complaints about while their secondary and local roads were not opened, obviously our first response was to open our main road networks, and then critical infrastructure recovery. What a lot of people did not know, and it did not make news, we lost our primary electric feed to our water treatment plant during the tornado. And unfortunately, when we went to go to backup power, the backup generator was actually destroyed in the tornado as well. So we lost all power at the water treatment facility. We had about 36 hours of water in supply that we were good. So we had a window of about 36 hours to where we had to get power back to our water treatment facility, or the community was really going to be in some serious issues. So we had some people wondering why we weren't working on some other electrical loads earlier, but obviously the water was our #1 priority at that particular time. This was all the night of or the morning of the storm when these type of decisions were made. So what happens when the sun comes up the next day and you start to grasp the severity? Like #1, I'll be honest with you, even though we had the tabletop exercises, when we saw the volume, we had to have help. The assessment part of it was kind of high level at the time. But yes, there were FEMA officials and GEMA officials already in town working, but there was no other way to do it than we had to have help. And we'll talk a little bit about that process of help in just a minute. Community. Wow, if this ever happens in your community, and I hope it doesn't, I'd imagine that the community will respond the way our community responded. The number of people, the number of volunteers was so large that we actually had difficulty in managing the volunteers and getting them into the storm zone. So we ended up creating, through one of our nonprofit partners, an organization that actually would oversee and manage and distribute the volunteers in and out of the community, whether it was as simple as handing out food and water, clothing, or assisting with chainsaws and tree removal, etc. It was a big effort to certainly to organize all of those volunteers, but it was heartwarming to certainly see. Let's go back up. I want to talk about the impacts a little bit. Keep in mind, this storm was inside the city and also in unincorporated Cleatus County as well. But the numbers you're seeing here on your page now, these are just city of Newnan numbers. We had 130 red tag structures. What that means by red tagged is they were not inhabitable. They were either completely destroyed or destroyed to the point that damaged to the point that it wasn't safe for the owners or the tenants to occupy. So I had 130 of those. Had 214 yellow tag structures, which were structures that had significant damage, but there were areas of the home that were inhabitable, that could be inhabited, or areas that we could get them in and turned around quickly. To the right of that, you'll see kind of what our progress has been. Of the 130 red tag structures, we've made substantial progress in the community, and only 18 remain with no activity. I thought that's pretty good within a year. And of the 214 yellow tag structures, we have 72 of them that have remained without any progress. And most of this, let's be honest, is related to either the lack of insurance or underinsured, or the supply chain or contractor chain. And over the past probably 3 months, the number's gotten much better. Over 650 re-roofs. You can imagine, even if you weren't in the direct line of the storm, with a storm of that magnitude, there's a lot of re-roofing structures. The debris, that's just an amazing number, almost 400,000 cubic yards of what we call vegetative debris. I'll show you some examples of that in a minute. It's pretty outstanding to see. a lot of people don't think about it, your signage around town. We had 164 stop signs that were destroyed, almost 300 street signs, and after it was all said and done, we had about 14,000 square feet of concrete repair. You may say, why concrete repair? Well, either because a tree fell over and the root ball destroyed the sidewalk and the curbing, or as we were clearing the streets and removing trees, we destroyed a lot of concrete and asphalt at that point in time as well. Utilities, look at that, 167 street lights that were destroyed, 246 poles, 129 transformers, and almost 150,000 feet of wire that had to be replaced. We're fortunate, we're part of the MEAG system. I know several of you probably are as well, but we had mutual aid from 17 different electrical partners, including Georgia Power. The area that was hit was not a Georgia Power territory, but they were unbelievable partners and sent massive amount of crews to help us get restored. And we had power back to pretty much every neighborhood in less than a week, which is amazing considering the overall damage. A lot of people may know Newnan as Tree City USA. We've been Tree City USA for over 25 years. This was an interesting image that the forestry department came in and did for us. At the top was our tree canopy before the storm. You can see a whole lot more green than you see gray. The bottom is our tree canopy in the storm zone after the storm, and you can see there it's projected based upon this GIS model that the city lost about 53% of our tree canopy in that storm zone. I talked about the debris removal and almost 500,000 cubic yards of vegetative debris. Well, when we started, the first idea was we were going to take the vegetative debris to the Coweta County C&D landfill. Well, after about a day and a half of going to the landfill, the county called and said, hey, we're trying to be good neighbors and help you out, but you're inundating our C&D landfill. We just don't have the capacity to take your volume. So we had to think really quick. We own a composting operation about 10 miles outside the city, a lot of acreage there. We decided we were going to take it there, but then after a couple of days there, we quickly learned that we also didn't have the footprint to accommodate the debris. So we actually had to undertake a grading and clearing operation to clear out a large pad and put in gravel roadways so that we could actually haul off the debris. If you look at that picture closely, you'll see in that picture, you'll see large excavators, large trucks, and you can see how small they look in the middle of all those mountains of trees. But yeah, just simple finding places to store the debris and haul the debris off and compost it was certainly a challenge for us as well. All right, let's talk a little bit about what we had to put into action. I'm going to admit, even though we had done our tabletop exercises and adopted our emergency management plan, we did not have pre-event contracts. Let me say that again. We did not have pre-event contracts. And you may ask, what's a pre-event contract? A pre-event contract is a storm response, emergency response contract that basically sits in your file and no one uses unless you have an event like we had. But because we did not have such, we had to issue emergency contracts, and we issued them for building evaluation. You heard me mention the red tag and the yellow tag structures. I just don't have enough resources in our city to continue with the building permit inspection with the rest of the city and also do storm response. So we did the building evaluation, emergency contract, debris removal. Obviously, we got a lot of resources in public works, but not enough to remove 400, 500,000 cubic yards of vegetative debris out of the roadways and from public places. So I issued that emergency contract. And also, if you hope to get reimbursed from FEMA for debris removal, you have to have debris monitoring. They monitor that truck that's picking up the debris from what they call cradle to grave. But we issued all three of those emergency. The problem with that is anytime you issue something in an emergency, even though the mayor issued the state of emergency relaxing certain procurement policies, that sometimes doesn't matter to FEMA. To actually get reimbursed under an emergency contract, there are very, very, very extensive and specific steps you have to go through to maintain your FEMA eligibility. So what we had to do is go hire a very expensive FEMA attorney, someone who works with FEMA, knows the ins and outs of FEMA. They were actually out of Louisiana. So we had to hire that attorney to guide us through the emergency process to remain eligible for FEMA reimbursements. You can avoid all of that unnecessary work if you have pre-event contracts. Talk a little bit more about that in just a minute, but relaxation of ordinances and procedures. Not only did we have our standard relaxation when the mayor issued the state of emergency, for several council meetings after that, there were further and further and further actions as we identified needs. And I'll give you a couple of examples. Number one, council decided to relax all building permit fees to anyone in the storm that was trying to recover from the storm. They did certain things as we allowed the placement of dumpsters in roadways, pods in roadways, even porta potties for the contractors in roadways, which we would have never done that previously. We allowed the placement of RVs and mobile homes and all types of different temporary housing anywhere in the storm zone because housing was critical. We were already in a housing shortage, just like many of you are, but then when we were hit with the tornado, there was 100% no occupancy in our local hotels for several months. So we had to think outside the box and try to find temporary housing. So a lot of different things. Even with zoning and rebuilding, after a month or so, we realized that the storm hit an area of town where there was a lot of what we call non-conforming structures because of zoning. Council lifted all of those requirements and allowed the homeowners, property owners to rebuild without having to go seek variances or a lengthy process. So there was a lot of different steps. We even relaxed the payment of property taxes. We relaxed payment of occupational taxes. We did a lot of different things to try to help out our community and help them rebuild. But the volunteer organization, I want to hit on that a little bit. I will say one thing. If you're ever in this situation and you think your community can recover, it can only recover if you allow the volunteers and the citizens to take the lead. That may sound a little bit different than we at local government normally talk about. We still had to run a business here. We still had to run our daily operations, police, fire, planning, building inspection services, Main Street events. And it quickly became apparent to us that the community was so involved in such high stakeholders that they basically took the reins and they established the long-term strategies. They established housing committees. They established grant opportunities through nonprofits. So we were so blessed in that regard. While we have a seat at the table for the recovery, it's actually being led by the community and the volunteers, which in my opinion is certainly been the way to do it. Long term, talk about that FEMA public assistance. You hear a lot about the nightmares of FEMA, and we've been through some smaller storms and they have been difficult. But after we got through the difficulty of the emergency contracts to making certain that we were going to remain FEMA eligibility, I'm here to tell you that FEMA has been great for us to work with. We were receiving originally 75% reimbursement. We were just notified a few weeks ago due to some new legislation that our reimbursement from FEMA is going to go up to 90%. So I can't sit here and say much of anything other than good stuff about our FEMA partners. And I also want to, talk about our partnership. I know we're on a GMA call. City of Newnan's in our government liability and property insurance. That program for us was outstanding. While we didn't have any structures completely leveled, I think we had about 17 different claims through Gurma, and James Westbury and his team handled us. It was so simple, and I'm so blessed that they made that so easy that we could focus on the community. Go down to the third bullet points. After we did our emergency contracts and we got approval for those, we had to turn them into on-call contracts. And that's where I'm going to tell you that your community, your city needs on-call contracts in case. So we currently have on-call contracts for debris monitoring, and the housing evaluation. You probably don't need the housing evaluation, but you certainly need the debris hauling and the debris monitoring. And I have examples of those RFPs that I'd be happy to share with GMA so they can distribute, and you can modify those to fit the needs of your community. We had a lot of Alan Jackson, Newnan's son. He came home and did a Where I Come From benefit concert, raised several $1 million for us. That was, number one, a blessing and also a curse. If you ever had to put on a concert in your community where you're not accustomed to putting on a concert for about 35,000 people, it was logistically tough, but we were willing to step up to the challenge just for the benefit of the community. We have new organizations such as Plant Newnan that has established from the storm. Plant Newnan, their sole charge is to replenish the tree canopy for the next generation here in Newnan. They're doing a great job. Our community foundation, they're the ones who stepped up to the plate, and they own the long-term recovery efforts. The city and the county did decide to go in and jointly fund a long-term recovery director that works for the foundation. So that's been a great blessing to have those efforts housed out of the foundation and not out of the city's office. Talk a little bit about the FEMA response and how good they've been, but I will tell you, to date, we've spent about $12 million in storm response. And if you look at the chart you see on your computer there, to date, I've received just under $3.5 million in reimbursement back. What that means is the FEMA program is a reimbursable program. We were able to respond quickly because we have fund balance, and we have a healthy fund balance. I know some cities do and some cities struggle with fund balance. But we got some criticism over the years that maybe our fund balance was too large and maybe we were overtaxing our citizens. But after this storm response, that tone has changed completely. And now everyone understands the importance of fund balance. Without such, I would not have been able to spend $12 million in the way we spent in an attempt to recover our community in pre-storm condition. And I think that's pretty much it. I know that was kind of a quick and dirty overview, but I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Cleatus. And before I turn it over to the members to ask questions, I actually have one of my own. Did y'all have any issues with disaster voyeurs and folks that just came into the community in the immediate aftermath, and how did you handle that? Yes,
you're going to have the storm chasers. Rushi, I think is what, most refer to them. Yeah. Handled it in a couple of different ways. Number one, even though we had some complaints, our emergency ordinance required contractor registration. Even though we waived the permits, we required contractors to register. And then we tried to get that word out to the citizens. Our inspectors were boots on the ground. And we feel pretty confident that, most everyone we saw, we got them registered. And to be registered, you had to show your proof of insurance and your licenses and et cetera. That was the number one step to how we try to prevent that. Two is educational. And number three, the insurance commissioner's office did a spectacular job of coming down and getting information out to our citizens on how to identify and how to respond to those situations.
I really appreciate that information. I've seen too many stories of cities that get hit by a disaster where you get some not so good people come in and take advantage of others.
Now, Rishi, there's still some stories for some individuals. They got taken. I mean, I'm not going to sit here and deny that, but there are some steps you can try to take to minimize it.
Yeah. I'll open it up now to y'all. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask Cleatus. Any questions? Well, I'll ask another one, Cleatus. You know, you had a double disaster basically because we were still, and still are, but especially then in the middle of the COVID pandemic, and vaccines had just come out when y'all got hit by the tornado. How did that interact with the second disaster?
Well, let me back up a little bit, and I think the biggest takeaway from that, and I'm just going to be honest, the organization and the community was already stressed to a certain extent because of the pandemic responses, and some of it wasn't politically popular, if you're going to say. And then when you compounded it with a tornado response, I will say this: it did appear that COVID disappeared in our community for a while, when all of the focus seemed to center on the tornado storm recovery. As far as, the city mandates for one person per vehicle and all of that stuff, I'll be honest with you, Rishi, that stuff kind of got put to the wayside during the tornado response. But more than anything, just the amount of stress I think it put on the entire organization with compounding the situation.
You can understand that. And that's the thing, is sometimes disasters don't just happen by themselves. They happen with other ones. So does anyone else have any questions before we go to Becky? Oh, hey, Letitia. Go for it.
I was just curious, now that you've gone through this experience, what type of communications do you think, what was in place that worked, or are there any systems or anything that you see in retrospect that cities may want to consider?
Well, obviously, I think prior to the event, we had our text alert system that we had been utilizing for a couple of years. But let's be honest, it's a registration system. You actually had to sign up for the text alerts that come directly from Coweta County EMA. But since the storm, we've had a much better rate of subscribers to that text alert system. But here's the interesting one, Letitia. And I know many communities have outdoor storm sirens, correct? But there's a little bit of a misconception of what the outdoor siren was meant to be. It's meant to be an outdoor notice. If you look at the locations of your outdoor sirens, they're around public places, gathering places, schools, etc. But we had a lot of complaints that the sirens could not be heard inside the homes. Well, obviously that wasn't really the intent of outdoor sirens, but considering the extent of devastation and the fact that our elected officials want to do everything they can to try to protect the citizens, we are in the process of reevaluating the locations of our storm sirens, the types. There's new technology. Our technology in the storm sirens was a little dated, so we're actually going to be trying to procure a FEMA mitigation grant to substantially expand our siren network here in Newnan and Coweta County.
Are there any other questions for Cleatus? Going once, going twice. Cleatus, I really appreciate you joining us today and giving us this valuable information. And hopefully we don't have any major tornadoes in the next couple of months